Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality. It may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. This is Natasha Helfer, and this is the podcast where we we go after shame. Big time.
Love that.
Deconstructing it all day long.
Yes, we're not going to use passive language here, learned passive language. We're going to say we do it. We do the thing here.
We do the thing. And I have an amazing guest today. I'm so excited. I have Brittany Hartley. She has recently come out with a book called No Nonsense Spirituality. It's brilliant. It's definitely a wonderful read, I think both from an intellectual and spiritual framework, and falls right in line with so many of the things that I feel passionately about. But before we get further into the weeds, I do want to just give a shout out to my Facebook page, natashahelfer.com. You can go there to donate to this podcast and also to check out all the other podcast stuff available. We have some great episodes up on all kinds of intersections of mental health, sexuality, spirituality, religion, etc. I also want to just say that I've got a 20% off early bird special for my fall groups, one of them being religious trauma, which is definitely one of the ones that we'll be talking about today, and also reclaiming female sexuality and just lots of different things in that regards. So check all of that out. Brittany, you can find her in regards to social media as No Nonsense Spirituality. So that's a great way to look her up. And just to give you a little bit more about her before we dive into just having a conversation, Brittany has a master's degree in theology with a focus in the future of American religion. And she currently does quite a bit of work as an atheist spiritual director, which is really fascinating to talk to her about that as well. So we are really excited to dive into this book. And I'm going to just say right now too that I'm kind of wanting to lean into a lot of the feminist lens type of things that you brought up. But tell us a little bit more about yourself. What am I missing in your bio? How to be who you are, etc.
Well, I'll say in the context of this conversation that it's just so lovely to be with you, because I came across your work over a decade ago, and at that time you were really speaking out against some of the Mormon church's stance on masturbation. And I ended up, and I've told you this in person, and I think I told you this last time we podcasted, that data that you put out, I sent to my parents in order to help them realize that pushing my younger brother, who was gay, who was meeting at the time, he was meeting with the bishop every 2 weeks to talk about if he had masturbated that week. And anyway, your work on that helped my entire family be able to get some new tools in order to help my brother, who went from being in the church and suicidal and gay to now outside the church and thriving. And so for me to see you, like when I presented at Thrive and you were there, and to be having this conversation with you, it's just a really full circle moment, because at the time I was just a nuanced girl who was just checking out, stuff that you were doing that was helping my brother to heal. And, since then I went on, in the past decade, especially really went on my own spiritual journey. And now we get to have this conversation, and that just feels really full circle for me. And it's just really beautiful to be here with you today.
Wow, thank you. That's very, really, truly touching. And I'm so glad that at least we came together in some energy force even a decade ago.
Yes.
I wasn't
Mhm.
consciously aware, and I'm super glad we're consciously aware of our connection now.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that.
I love it. Well, yeah, so tell us a little bit about where you come from as far as your own religious background, your kind of, what got you interested in studying theology. That's not something that I hear a lot of Mormon young women necessarily go into. So that's exciting in of itself to kind of hear a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I grew up Mormon and was removed from my home at the age of 16 for having sex. And we can talk about any of that if you want to. Those wounds are very healed for me now, and I have a great relationship with my parents now. And kind of at that time found nuanced Mormonism or nuanced Christianity, and that helped me kind of heal this really this deep wound of being kicked out of my home and being disconnected from my family. So for a while, by the time I was 17 at BYU Idaho, I would be a nuanced Mormon at that time, and I was studying history and philosophy. I really wanted to go into philosophy, but everybody told me, but you have to have a PhD to do philosophy, and then you won't be able to have children. And so I kind of got pushed into history because then I could teach high school history, which I did. But still, my mistress was always philosophy, and I'd always been a curious mind and a deep thinker and the questioner. And eventually along that road, lost my Mormon faith. That started with polygamy, then went to theology school to try to get a better sense of God and Christianity. And maybe I just had the wrong religion. And in theology school, lost my faith in Christianity, also lost my faith in God, lost my sense of morality, lost my sense of self, lost my identity, lost my community, lost my belief in free will. I mean, it was just this bulldozer for me. Really until I had nothing left and experienced nihilism or the void or deep existential crisis. And since then, found tools along the way to help me be able to restructure my life, to go from the void and even suicidality to a place where I feel like I'm happy to be alive now. And those tools were really central to secular spirituality because I couldn't believe anything anymore. I have a BS meter from being raised Mormon where I don't want to be expected to believe something, even New Age spirituality. I was allergic to truth claims, which is very common for people who leave Mormonism. And so my book is really just about all the tools that I gathered being in history and philosophy and studying religion for the past 2 decades. And now I try to present those tools in a way that how can I get you the tool with as little belief or faith required? Can we just get straight to the tool rather than the dogma around it? So that's the work that I do now.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And you and I have had discussions in the past about mental health and spirituality. And a lot of the research will show like people who are involved in religious communities trend to do better from a mental health perspective, social support perspective, a lot of things. And I think that gets used to say, see, religion is healthy, right? Religion is good.
Or even this religion is true.
But this religion is true because, of course, people, when they read that type of literature, they only think of their own religion. They don't think about other people's religions. And and how can they all be true in regards to the research? But then we know through our own lived experience and also a lot of the research that's coming out on religious trauma and that religion can be really harmful, especially if you're treated as outlier. It's interesting that you were kicked out of your home for sexual exploration, I'm guessing, sexual behavior, which for the most part is pretty normative as a teen to be exploring that type of aspect of yourself. I have a similar story getting kicked out of BYU for my, here's 2 of us growing up in a Mormon community where there's high level consequence, right? High level consequence and cost for our sexual expression. Yes. Doesn't conform with the standards. And we'll talk a little bit more about this and how you kind of distinguish between male versus female spirituality in regards to like some of the traits of how we consider the male, the masculine, the feminine. So that's So I guess before we go into that too much, I'd like to just ask you a little bit about this mental health perspective. What is your perspective on that?
Symmetry is now offering ketamine services. To find out more, go to simcounseling.com/ketamine-services.
You quoted, was it an awakened mind or awakened brain? I forget now.
Yeah, there's a book called The Awakened Brain, and she's done multiple other books, but Lisa Miller has some great statistics. She's a professor at Columbia, and she has a lot of great data on this idea that religion is, especially kind of softer forms of religion, not too high on the cults, not too high on the cult scale, but it does seem to be that religion is good for you in some ways. Certainly the communal aspects, there's some longevity data that we have. There's some resistance to depression, which is a really big one. And the overwhelming thing, and something that atheists need to take seriously, is that if we could bottle spirituality and put it into a pill, it would be our strongest pill against depression, against risky behaviors, suicidality, just across the board. And so there's something going on deeper than just dogma and truth claims. There's something about spirituality that coincides with the science of well-being that's worth looking at. Even if you're an agnostic, even if you're an atheist, even if you have religious trauma, there's still something about spirituality, which I just define as connection to deepest self and outside of self. There's something about that, and there are tools in that space that are good for our mental health, and we have data to show it. And so the disconnect where I was at was, okay, how do I get these tools when I'm so allergic to truth claims? I'm so allergic to anything that is going to be too woo or requiring me to have faith. But I'm looking at the data here, and I'm showing that rituals are good for our mental health, awe, states of transcendence, forms of contemplation, community, story, inspiration, working with your subconscious, symbolic language, all of these things. This isn't just woo. We have data that says that these things are good for you, good for your brain, good for your relationships. And so I was really, a lot of my journey was about, how can I get this tool? How can I get to the essence of this tool and find a way to apply it to my life in an authentic way, so that I can have the tool without the bullshit. And then as I was kind of doing that work, I realized that not only could I do that for myself, but I could also help others based on however they were authentically expressing their own spiritual paths. I could help them kind of find those tools and apply those tools to their life too. And so there is an overlap between spirituality and good mental health that we need to take seriously. Even as atheists, we need to take that data seriously, because it's strong enough data that we can't just throw it away and say that it's all woo.
Yeah. Well, I love how you break down you kind of categorize things into three spaces. It's like you've got the religion, you've got the occult, and then you've got like skepticism or atheism, right? And that all three bring something to the table. And I think what I loved most about your book was just the permission and the encouragement to seek out your own like medley of all those things that can be used for your well-being. I think the main problem both of us, I think, would agree on is that certain religions take all these other things you just mentioned, right? Like all the things that are about the well-being, but they co-opt them. Like you can only find these things in this particular sect or in this particular ritual. So I love your kind of emphasis on reclaiming, sorting out, what do I want to keep? What do I want to not want to keep, etc. So I think, yeah, it's useful to be able to do that. And you're also very upfront about your own struggle with suicidality and kind of that sense of meaning of loss of life as you're going through deconstruction of your religion, of your identity. And I know that I've seen a lot of that as well as a clinician.
Yeah, I'm sure you have.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go into any disclosures or disclaimers maybe you want to make as we start talking about this kind of from a female versus masculine lens. what are we
Absolutely.
talking
Yeah.
about? I don't think we're talking about men and women necessarily.
Yes.
So can you,
Yeah. So before we jump into this kind of gendered language, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to make a caveat here. When I'm using these terms, I am not at all saying this is the journey of a penis or the journey of a vagina. That's not what we're talking about here. We're more talking about this in the concept of something like the archetype of the heroine's journey, where everyone who goes through the heroine's journey, whatever your gender expression, at the end of that heroine's journey is a balance between the traits that we've called masculine, which tend to be more outer oriented and action oriented, and the traits that we've called feminine, which is more of this intuitive space. And I think both people or every person benefits from kind of looking at their masculine, kind of the action oriented. What are you doing out in the world? What are you doing? And what are you feeling? What are you intuiting? And I think that that's just human nature, and anyone can benefit from kind of diving into that space. And so when I'm using a word like feminine, I'm really just talking about this list of characteristics that we've called feminine. If we wanted to call that red or something like that, we could use different words if we wanted to, but historically, especially in story, we've kind of put a gender to these list of characteristics. And so when I talk about the feminine or the masculine, I'm not in any way kind of saying that this is what you're supposed to be if you're a woman, or this is what men are supposed to be. I'm not talking about anything like that. I'm just talking about these are aspects of human nature we've called masculine. These are aspects of human nature we've called feminine. I've not ever met anyone who's 100%, of one and nothing of the other. We're all a mix of both and all. So that's the caveat that I like to give before I move into it. But if it's okay, I would love to read just the maybe 1 minute long or 2 minutes long, the start of the Depatriarchy, Your Spirituality presentation that I gave at Thrive that you listened to just kind of start us off. So can I read that?
I would love you to.
Okay. So it starts like this. From Gandhi, I learned that kindness and equality didn't apply to his wife, whom he abused and controlled. In Christianity, I learned that we sing hymns to praise the life-giving power of blood, but only when it is blood shed by a man. A woman's blood is unsanitary and unclean. The Buddha taught me about enlightenment, but that women are roadblocks to transcendence. It is acceptable to leave your wife and child to go sit under the Bodhi tree. Einstein taught me about awe for the nature of reality and the God of Spinoza, but that his first wife deserves no mention in his footnotes. Her place was to do his housework. Swami taught me about the spiritual unity of humankind, but also that it is only women who have the added tasks of being modest, pure, and submissive to their husbands. I learned about civil rights and nonviolence through Martin Luther King Jr. in school, but that women were still sexual objects first and foremost. I attended hot yoga classes and through the teachings of Bikram learned about the mind-body-spirit connection, only to be devastated later when it was uncovered that he was sexually abusive to women behind closed doors. Mormonism, my first faith language, told me that God had spoken again to a prophet in the modern days and that this God demanded polygamy. The teenage girls who were told to marry him or their families would go to hell were simply collateral damage to the Mormon God. I learned from the Dalai Lama about inner peace and simple living, but when he was asked if a female Dalai Lama should succeed him, he said, she would not be of much use unless she was attractive. When called out on this, he said it was just a joke. Muhammad and Islam gave me language for various parts of my soul, but judged a woman's soul as less valuable when it came to her autonomy, voice, or inheritance. Tolstoy taught me about how to survive nihilism, but his wife Sophia's diaries show a broken-hearted woman who had to suppress her own needs, life, and curiosity to serve a genius who cared more about dead philosophers than his own family. Catholicism taught me that defense of the institution and defense of marriage came before the tears of women when men do what men do. And lastly, as a woman in the West, I learned that God, with male pronouns in our holy texts, is solely responsible for the creation of life, not the women who bear humanity and continue to die in childbirth. While each of these spiritual paths had tools for me that I still benefit from, the cost was the underlying message to women that I had subconsciously internalized. Man decides what is spiritual and woman is less than. Thoughts?
Yeah, that was very powerful. You got a standing ovation for your talk at Thrive. Um, it was very powerful to hear you speak in this way. And I think that part of the caveats, when you say we're talking about traits, I think I also want to just call out that although we are just talking about traits, we are also talking about history, his story, where, people who were born with penises did have a lot more privilege, did have a lot more ability to be writing the texts, the philosophy.
Yeah. And it's not even just men, it's specifically priest class men, which is then men that are being supported by the community. That those men in the West have been, even in the East too, have been the ones that have defined what spirituality is. And so, yes, even though we can talk about general terms like masculine and feminine, we also have to recognize the history that when there are no actual female voices, and the only ones that are describing what spirituality is are people who have time to do specific rituals because they're being supported by a community, then that's going to color everything that we understand about spirituality and religion, because those are the people that are essentially outlining what spirituality even is. And so the shocking thing for me is, I left Mormonism over a decade ago, and yet it was only in the past maybe 3 or 4 years. Because, when I left Mormonism, I had this thought like, okay, I went through the polygamy journey. Like, I've unpacked patriarchy. Like, I think I've really unpacked this. And then, as you know, it's like, then you understand, then you learn about like the medical history of what women have gone through. And then you learn about this. And then I feel like I was just continually unpacking it and being surprised at how much patriarchy I had internalized. And then realizing that even outside of Mormonism, even outside of Christianity, that what I was calling spiritual was still so dictated by this specifically male voice and this masculine side of spirituality that didn't fit my life as a woman. And that was a long time after leaving Mormonism that I had gotten to that place. I didn't see that at first because it was so internalized. But it was just a huge part of my own spiritual journey. And it's really what allowed my spirituality to flourish, because I let go of the shoulds of this specific kind of action-oriented voice that says you need to wake up at 5 a.m., you need to take an ice bath, you need to do your 2-hour meditation, you need to go give service, then you need to do this, and your meditation needs to look like this. You need to, sit in a full lotus pose and make sure that you go to Costa Rica and do ayahuasca. And it's like this list of all the things you have to do to be spiritual. And I was kind of trying to do the list and then realizing like, oh my God, why am I doing this? I'm doing this because this masculine side that is defining what spirituality is doing it in this very action-oriented way, in a way that doesn't fit my life as a mother of young children. I'm not always going to be able to wake up at 5 a.m. and do an ice bath. That's just not going to be a regular part of my spiritual practice in this stage of my life. Mm-hmm. And so it's just been a huge part of my own spiritual growth to reclaim what spirituality is when you add in the feminine voice.
I love that. Miriam Moore, who's listening, says, I felt I was rolling in a dryer trying to find the female body and the respective male spirituality, right? So just kind of tumbling around. I think, you mentioned, just for people who may not understand, because not everybody who listens comes from a LDS or Mormon background. And so when you say, you kind of went through polygamy, I want to just clarify that those of us who are in the mainstream Latter-day Saint faith, we're not necessarily practicing polygamy, but we've also been we've done a pretty good job of whitewashing the history of that within the church and not really looking at the historical context, and especially those who come from pioneer ancestry. Oftentimes that's a big part of deconstructing a Mormon journey is looking at that polygamous history, whereas some of the
Yes.
fundamental sects that are fundamental Mormonism are still practicing polygamy. So I don't, if you wanted to say,
Yes.
clarify that, but
Yes, it's so good. And I have to remind myself to take that lens out, because sometimes when two Mormons start talking to each other, we can get into a shorthand. But yes, I'm not meaning that like that all kinds of non-monogamous kind of relationships are, something evil, or making a statement of that matter. I'm really talking about that my Mormon journey, really a lot of it started with, was really kind of trying to unpack the coercive nature of polygamy and what that meant to my beliefs that this was a prophet, or this prophet was being led by God. It was the coercive nature of this polygamy, which was, you'd have to just admit, I mean, even apologists would then have to admit that in the economy of heaven, the woman is less than. I mean, she's really being coerced in many times in these situations. And that was deeply troubling for me. And so it kind of started me on that journey. So good catch there.
Yeah, just a little, explanation, because I think it is fascinating, especially those who are not of our background, to understand. It can be confusing, like who believes what and all of that. But so let's talk a little bit about, one of the slides you put up at Thrive was called When God Was a Woman. And so let's go back to kind of these feminist traits, or feminine traits, or what we might deem feminine, and kind of what historically in your research about that.
Yeah, one of the things that was shocking to me, and again, just shows how much kind of I had really internalized patriarchy, is that we do have in the West, we do have hero women. We have people like Mary, the mother of Jesus, but I didn't realize until I'd studied old matriarchies. So we're talking before the agricultural revolution, so before 10,000 BC. And when we look at those goddesses, they were just in such a different sphere than kind of the woman prophets that you kind of get a whisper about in scripture here and there. And so for Mary, for example, people will say, oh, we have the feminine in Christianity, we have Mary, but is she there for her wisdom? Is she there because she has something to offer? Or is she just there because she is a vessel for something masculine, for the male? And so when we go back and look at, before the agricultural revolution, where singular storm gods became very powerful for all these societal and cultural reasons that we can or don't have to get into. But before then, these divine goddesses were much more than just vessels or side characters like we get in the West. They were really central. And so when we look at goddesses like Isis, or early sculptures of Venus, and we see that these goddesses didn't just create life, which, although that is a big part of it, is their ability to create and sustain life, and certainly that was very sacred, but they also had aspects like music and language, which makes sense. Our early goddesses were language goddesses. And to me, that feels very intuitive, because even now, a 5-year-old girl on average is more socially developed at 5 than a 5-year-old boy. And so this was really the realm of the goddess. And these goddesses weren't singular and jealous like the Old Testament God. These were pantheons. And so it reflected our life at the time, which was communal. And these gods had different gifts. And at the center of all of these gods with different gifts was a female god who was just the center of life and the center of nature and language and music and art. And they were just really powerful and really interesting and really multidimensional in a way that I had never seen kind of explained about Mary or, other females that we have in the West. And so it was a really empowering process for me to go back and see, okay, before this Old Testament God started to become, just really singular and jealous and powerful, that we could see these matriarchies. And we know about matriarchies, and we know from in studying Indigenous communities who still run like matriarchies now, that we have solid data that shows that matriarchies are more communal. There's going to be less depression, there's less poverty, there's less crime. And also you get this concept of everybody kind of contributing to the tribe their own gifts and having that be very sacred and very plural. And it's just really beautiful and really good for our well-being. The problem is patriarchies and dogmas and these religions, they produce a lot of resources. You're able to control female fertility, you're able to control land, you're able to control power, you're able to create resources at just this rapid rate. And so matriarchies across the world in the East and the West really fell to more patriarchal kind of societies that symbolized more power and authority and hierarchy and promised protection and that kind of thing. And so we saw kind of the loss of matriarchies. And so it was empowering to learn about the goddesses that existed before the Old Testament God and this communal way of life and these really powerful goddesses that I'd never seen kind of expressed in the West. But it was also a mourning too of missing that there's still a part of us that still desires to live in communities like that, where we're that, that held and interconnected. And we were saying off the air earlier that we don't want to just put this title, fuck the patriarchy and have all the men go away and run away with shame. This is really an invitational thing. When we look at matriarchies, one of the concerns is that matriarchy is just flipped patriarchy, where the women are controlled, or the women are in control and the men are controlled. And that's not what we see. That's not what we see at all. We see men being really valued in the tribe for more than just what they provide, for actually who they are, which when you listen to the male loneliness epidemic is what men want. And so, this idea of the feminine divine isn't just for women, and it isn't just fuck the patriarchy and fuck men and all of this. It's, hey, if we add this other voice here that we've lost, it actually helps everyone. It gives you more options for spiritual paths. It gives you more tools for this other side of yourself that we all have. And these feminine goddesses, they weren't jealous in the way the Old Testament God is. Their message was for everyone. Their community was everyone. They were mother to everyone. And so it's different. Matriarchy is very different than patriarchy in that way. So that was just really, yeah. What do you think there?
No, I think that's beautiful. And I think you're putting words in for me. So I'm just processing this right now, which is always dangerous when I process something right in the moment. it's like what I think what I didn't like about the Barbie movie. I liked overall, right? But at the end, it still felt like it was us versus them. It wasn't like we didn't really solve the issue, as far as it's either men in control or women in control. So I really love that you talked about, matriarchy is not flipped patriarchy where somebody's in control or somebody is better than. It's like this communal kind of word is actually very pivotal in what you're saying.
That's true. It's like we need a Barbie too. So the end of Barbie, so the whole Barbie movie, and I did a podcast on this, the whole Barbie movie follows the heroine's journey. And the heroine's journey is, something happens that's wrong. You put on the masculine in order to deal with some shit. You burn out because you're just in this action-oriented place. Then you do this kind of deep dive into your feelings and all of your repressed everything. And then you kind of heal the wounded feminine and you heal the wounded masculine. And at the end, there's supposed to be kind of a balance between your feminine and masculine energy. And so the end of the Barbie movie, in saying that we could just be friends, Ken and Barbie could be friends, it was kind of just supposed to symbolize that we're going to start on equal footing. We're going to do this on equal footing. We're just going to be friends. And because you're a person and I'm a person, we're going to be friends. But it is kind of calling for a Barbie too, where it's like, okay, and if we carried that out, what would it look like? Like, how can we have a society of some Kens and Barbies that are all valued members of Barbie and Ken society? And yes, it's kind of calling for that. But I did like the movie,
including the non-binary Barbies and the
yes, and then
trans Barbies, and
yes, it adds some complexity. But it'd be nice if a movie could show us how that would work and how we could attain that.
Well, it also reminds me of a story because you mentioned at the beginning that it's not just men who in general who benefit from patriarchy. It's certain class of men, right? And you had shared at Thrive, which if you're comfortable sharing here, some stories about your partner, your husband, I believe it was.
Yeah.
And how he didn't, patriarchy wasn't really helping him either. So are you comfortable sharing some of that?
Absolutely. So my husband was also raised Mormon, and we've been married almost 20 years now. And he kind of had some shame that he wasn't the Mormon guy. He didn't read scriptures. He didn't say prayers. He never really did. It was always a grind for him. He was never, had a big calling or anything like that. And there was some shame associated with that. And as I was kind of diving into all of the options for spirituality that I couldn't see before, because it was really under this heading of these rites and rituals from a specific kind of male voice. When I was starting to kind of blow that up and having conversations then with my husband about it, he began to have his own kind of spiritual journey. And when I was explaining, this is what spirituality is, it's just where you feel connected to yourself and outside of yourself. And he said, oh my God, I feel that as a triathlete. When I do my 2-hour, 3-hour long bike rides or runs, that is my time with myself. That is where I do my inner child work. That's where I do my shadow work. That's where I make my intentions for the next season of my life. And then when I go to this Ironman, and it's almost like a pilgrimage, and everyone is there and we're supporting each other, and we've all had our struggles and journeys to get here, and everybody's cheering at the finish line, and strangers are giving you hugs and saying, you're an Ironman, it's okay. And to him, that's something that he's connected to outside of himself, and it's community. And it really is a pilgrimage for him. It's sacred to him. A finish line is one of the most sacred. If you ever have a chance to just go for an hour and just watch a finish line, you'll get to see the full spectrum of just the human experience and human relationships. And it's just so beautiful. I just weep sometimes as I'm waiting for him and just watching people cross the finish line with all kinds of emotions going on their face. And so he began to claim that, hey, this isn't just exercise for him. He's not doing this because he wants to lose weight and look a certain way and it's all about vanity. He realized that, oh, this is actually my spiritual practice. And then he started to claim it as his spiritual practice and not have any shame for going on a 4-hour bike ride on a Sunday. And I'm supporting him because that's his church. And then he supports me with the things that are my church. And it just created this environment where we got to finally say, actually, these are the things that fill my spiritual cup. How can you support me? Here's the things that fill your spiritual cup. How can I support you? And then all of a sudden, just our individual spiritualities and our support for each other's spiritual journeys just really exploded. But it was because of what I was digging into with these feminine voices just expanding. It's just so expansive on what spirituality can be. And it doesn't have to be separated from your life in the kind of rites and rituals way that we get from priest class men kind of voices. And that, benefited him as a man as much as anyone.
Right. I love that. I loved that example that we can create our own church. What is church for me? Marcy Hennon Olson, who's listening, she says, I agree. We aren't asking for the pendulum to swing to a fully matriarchal society. We just need to come to a balance, right? Which is what we were talking about earlier. And then Julie Edwards says, that's so beautiful, Brittany, finding your own definition of spirituality. So we're getting some nice comments. I would love to read a quote, which I believe it's a quote from a book called Wild Mercy by Mirabai Starr that you had at the Thrive event. So I believe this is her, not you, but
yes,
if this is wrong. Anyway, she states, most of the spiritual books that have influenced us were written by men in societies where women were not included, which is what you've alluded to. You've been programmed by a lot of dead men who had no idea what it was to be a woman. Women are learning to resacralize our ordinary embodied experience. We are no longer willing to wait for invitations from men's ancient elite clubs. We do not believe true spiritual experience is limited to these privileged spaces. Instead, we find the face of the Holy One in the faces of our babies and our lovers, our elders and our coworkers, the dirty dishes and the deep quiet, that falls over our homes when everyone else is sleeping and we stand at the window looking at the moon.
Mm.
That is scripture to me, right?
It's scripture to me too.
Scriptural. That like touches me at every part of what I might call a soul that I have.
Mhm.
And you really did a beautiful job in the rest of your presentation talking about spiritual practice, and you kind of already mentioned that oftentimes spiritual practice is going to the East and going to a retreat, or, sitting at the feet of a guru or a mentor, or going on a ayahuasca journey, like all these doing things. But oftentimes the female experience is already doing of the babies and the dishes and the birthday parties. You talked about a birthday party experience, and how you started looking at that as spiritual practice. So I'd love for you to expand on all that.
Yeah, it feels almost embarrassing to talk about because it's so obvious to me now. But I would say 6 or 7 years ago, I still would have said that the person sitting on the mat meditating and doing a loving kindness meditation where you're wishing the whole world, love and wellness, that was spiritual. And, doing dishes and running errands and planning a birthday party, like that's not spiritual, right? And so you get this a lot with male spiritual voices in and out of religion. Because they really can oftentimes in their life wake up and not have to attend to the needs of others in the way that women often do. And so I still, and even with my clients, I will say 9 times out of 10, when I ask a woman, do you have a contemplative practice or a spiritual practice? 9 times out of 10, especially if it's a mother, they'll say, I try to meditate. My kids are running around my house. Like I can't turn my brain off. So I'm just not very, I try, but I'm not very spiritual. And what this book was really helpful for me, but also many others, that just blew open this idea. Why are we calling these things that are separate from your life spiritual? And yet you're just embodied daily experience. We've called that not spiritual. And really the reason is because women don't write scripture, and female spirituality historically has always been more embodied. It's less about transcending the body and going to other dimensions. It's less about how many hours of meditation can you do at a time, or make sure you do these specific rites and rituals daily or weekly or whatever it is. Female spirituality historically has really been about your daily embodied experience. And so this is really what propelled my spirituality, is saying, oh, when I'm thinking about my daughter and trying to prepare a birthday party for her, and I'm thinking about what her favorite color is, and I'm thinking about her friends, and I'm talking with her, and I'm wanting to make her just feel really, not in a materialistic way of like, how can I post this birthday party on Instagram and make people jealous. It's not that. Like, how can I actually make this child feel really seen and valued today on this day, on their birthday? And years ago, I never would have put that under the umbrella of spirituality, because men have never called that spiritual. It's always just kind of been women's work. And once I started to read from female mystics who had spirituality not as a separate part of their life, but as a rhythm in everything that they do in every part of their life, that's really when me as a woman, my spirituality started to change. So preparing for the birthday party is spiritual, and getting up in the middle of the night is ego work, and it's hard ego work, and it's meaningful ego work. And you meet your shadow when you're a mother, and you think thoughts that you wouldn't want to say out loud. And that's really where I met my shadow, is becoming a mother. And it's just been this shift for me that I would say years ago, I had a list of these are the things that I do for spirituality. And now it's like, no, I'm awake when I do the dishes, and I'm awake when I'm with my partner and looking into his eyes and realizing there's a whole different universe over there that's endlessly fascinating. And I'm spiritual when I'm planning my daughter's birthday party. And I'm spiritual when I create a meal and create a moment and then ritualistically clear off the counter, like I've always done in the same way that I usually do. It's a ritual. And it's just embedded into my life. And so from the outside, you may look at my life and say, there's nothing particular spiritual about this person. She calls herself a spiritual director, but she didn't meditate today. She didn't go in a sauna. She didn't do an ice bath. She didn't whatever. She didn't light a candle in the morning. Like really my spiritual life is very simple. I have 4 children, so it's short and it's simple and it's internal, but it's this shift where, oh, I can be awake all the time. And everything that I do can have a spiritual aspect to it, where it's about connection and being awake to the preciousness of this moment. And you can have that doing the dishes, and you can have that in quiet moments, and you really can have that just be a rhythm in your life. And I really didn't get that until I added feminine voices to my spiritual journey.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And especially kind of this idea that we can have spirituality found in the mundane of our lives.
Yes.
And it's interesting too, since we come from a patriarchal religion that really emphasized our value as women, as mothers, and that would be our divine and most important role, was this role where we just caretake for others. So I think a lot of people who come from our culture do have children, have a lot of children sometimes. And, but we're still not given a lot of spiritual, what would I would say, like clout, because we're not finding the time to do the other things that we're told are spiritual, like saying your prayers and reading your scripture and attending the temple and, doing your genealogy work, right? There's all the tasks that I think even Mormon women miss, this idea of, hold on, there's something actually really spiritual about what I'm doing in this role that I've been given.
And that may be one of the reasons that maybe I wasn't ready for this right away, because if you're told be a stay-at-home mom and this is sacred, but it's forced on you, then you need some time to just have some rejection from that, oh, I was more than this, and I need to mourn this, and I need to be angry at this, and you need to do all the things. But there's now just kind of been a reclaiming for me that there is something really sacred about sometimes the mundane or simple things or the relational kind of life of women. But the difference is, in Mormonism, you never get like a female leader in the church really just claiming her own experience, and that she has spiritual wisdom from her experience that everyone then can benefit from. The thing that Mormon women are doing, and you'll see this across kind of religions and patriarchies, is she's there to quote men, and she's there to just really bear testimony of the men and their experience and their doctrine and their kind of knowledge, and their experiences can just lend voice to kind of the male voices. And so they're there to be really a support piece. I've never heard a single, talk, especially in something like General Conference, these big kind of, speaker opportunities for women, where they didn't kind of quote or defer to a male voice as part of their presentation, because their power is not in their own spiritual practice. Even though we give them a lot of lip service that, oh, you're a stay-at-home mother and that's sacred and it's second to angels and blah, blah, blah. It's still not enough, though, for her to just say, I was up in the middle of the night for 3 years straight and I learned some shit, and I'm going to tell you about what I learned and how that was a part of my spiritual journey and the shadow work that I did in those moments. We never hear that, because it's not claimed as spiritual. It's kind of still to the side as woman's work. And so there is a difference. And so even though I'm talking about that there is something sometimes sacred about creating a meal or sweet moments with my children, it's different than when I was a Mormon woman and it was forced upon me. And even though it was forced upon me, you also don't then have any spiritual wisdom or authority on your own. You don't have that. You don't have that authority. Your voice is just there to support and give credence to the male voices.
Yeah, that's such an interesting thing that you're speaking of, is when we come across our spirituality from authentic spaces versus forced spaces, and what that does. I have a feeling I have a lot of wisdom in those stories of cracked nipples at 3 a.m. and thrash in the mouth of my babe. I think I have a lot of wisdom from all of that.
And that's never been scripture ever.
Yeah.
In across the world, west or east, lessons from cracked nipples has never been the spiritual lesson or scripture, never. And so that's the piece that, like, oh, there's something here that even though it's not been defined as spirituality. Talk to any woman who's met her shadow in the middle of the night where she's choosing love even though her body is screaming this hurts and her brain is screaming these either violent or resentful or awful thoughts, and you're choosing love in that moment. That is the hardest shadow work I can even think of. And yet we don't even call what she's doing ego work or shadow work or spiritual work. And we look at the man who's in India for 3 weeks sitting on a mat on vacation, and we're like, oh, that guy's thinking about love on vacation. He's so spiritual. And the woman who's bleeding out, and we're not calling her, you know, a spiritual guru for choosing love in the moments when it was the hardest to do so. And that's a travesty.
Well, and you even shared this thought that really made me think from a mental health perspective, you know, how we really demonize women who have thoughts or even follow through with harm of their children. They're kind of going into paranoia stages and postpartum depression. You know, like there is a lot of shadow work that it doesn't get talked about, because again, we sanctify the role of mother.
Yes.
They should want to be a mother. These feelings should come naturally, right? And you're looking at your baby sometimes going, I don't even know why I'm here, or just the very many dark thoughts and spaces that people can go to when especially postpartum. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I will. That's a personal thing for me. And I, let's see how I want to start this. When my first son was born, I only have one biological child, but it wasn't until he was 5 months old that the first woman in my life, of all the women, I'd had the baby showers, my mom's, aunties, grandma, but it wasn't until my child was 5 months until a woman, just a friend, said, by the way, if you're having, like, my son was having a hard time sleeping, if you're having like really dark or violent thoughts, you know, that's a stage that you can go through and it doesn't last forever and it's totally normal. And it was the first time that someone had told me that. And so it was just shocking for me that not only was it not talked about, and I just felt so much shame that apparently I'm not fit to be a mother because I'm having these thoughts. So shameful. But also it was taking away what I had gone through, that I chose love in moments when my body and mind were insane, like we're clinically, like, you know, could have been taken to a mental institution, because and from reports, we're finding that it's more and more common. That I just read one study, and it's a recent one, that showed that as much as 1 in 4 women, 25% of women, experience postpartum rage, where their body is just overwhelmingly angry at their partner, at their child, in a way that they know is irrational, and yet their body is responding that way. Mm-hmm. So if your body is this fire of rage, just biologically, and you're choosing to feed a child and sing a lullaby, and you want to tell me that that's not the most amazing shadow work and the most spiritual journey that a person could go on. And not only are we going to not talk about it, but we're not going to say like how amazing it is that you chose love in those moments, or you survived, or you didn't act out some of those violent thoughts that you were having. It just really takes away something that is so amazing that women do, that we just don't. We're beginning in society to call it emotional labor. We haven't even begun to call it spiritual, because it's just been so long that men have defined what spirituality is.
Wow. That's really powerful. I can imagine if we did talk about it, if we did honor that process, actually how much more supported people would feel in that postpartum experience, right? And instead of feeling so much shame that we even have those thoughts to begin with, or those experiences. Yeah, one of my kids was colicky for about 2 years straight, you know, and imagine not getting good rest. I mean, like, sleep deprivation is a form of torture.
Yeah.
And these poor little babies, I don't think they mean to torture us, but they're torturing us. And So,
And before then, I would have been like, I'm patient. I'm a patient person. I'm a pacifist. I don't have a violent bone in my body. And then I get in that state, and I definitely have I have violent thoughts for the first time, and they're terrifying. They're terrifying. The thoughts that are happening in my brain. There was a while I had one particularly rough child who had sensory issues. And every time that my husband would leave with the kids, I'd have fantasies about them driving off of the road so that I could get some sleep. I mean, I was really in a rough place. And trying to get through it really without a ton of resources, and to now be able to look back and be able to give myself the credit that's due there, that like, hey, that was really hard and you got through it, and none of it meant that you were a bad mother. These are and the things that women learn. I mean, we go onto these apps and we learn how to do deep shadow work. We learn how to do all of these things in especially meditation places, and yet women are having to learn how to do this. Like, oh, I'm having a violent thought, I'm going to let that thought pass, and I'm not going to give it, I'm not going to give it my attention. Thoughts come and go. They're having to learn that kind of on their own, just on the fly, and we're not calling it spiritual at all, because it's not in this specific, you need to be on a mat and you need to be doing this kind of breathing and it needs to be doing this kind of meditating. Like, you're doing it in the middle of the night, like with a quarter of your brain working at best. And so it's just amazing, the spiritual life that women lead. And it's devastating to me that so many women don't even think of themselves as spiritual beings or spiritual creatures, because they're not doing the list of what we've said spirituality is. That's the sad part for me.
Right. Right. Well, I definitely wanted to bring in the piece of motherhood. On the other side of things, we have a great comment here by Brandy Ann Reeves. She says, when I first heard Britt talk about her spirituality and really in relation to motherhood, it made so much sense. But then it also sent me down a rabbit hole trying to find what mine would be as someone who has never been a mother or caregiver of any kind. I'm still working it out. So I think, sometimes we do conflate female or femininity with motherhood or caretaking. And some people either do out of choice or not mothers, and or don't want to be mothers. So do you want to speak to spiritual outside of the motherhood realm?
Yes. So when we talk about feminine voices, or historically, the feminine voice in spirituality, there is that motherhood piece often, but not always, and not exclusively, because even our female goddesses were much more than wombs. They were their own being. They had gifts to offer, and they were especially relational gifts and artistic gifts and creative gifts and intuitive gifts. And so I see women do this in many ways other than being a mother. For me, a lot of my shadow work came from adopting children and the struggles with that. But I see women being divine goddesses in so many ways, in relational ways and in intuitive ways and in the creative ways that they have. Anything that's not just this action energy that is doing, like, that you're just in that space of checking things off of a list, tends to be more of what we call a feminine space. And so, I see many women doing feminine goddess in ways that don't include children, sometimes don't even include like an extended family, but their work is where they do that, or their relationships, or their female friendships, or their art, or their exploration, or their claiming of their body. Body is very important in female spirituality, which is really different from the male voice. From the male voice, we often get this try to control the body, try to kill the ego, try to transcend the body. And women have historically, in female voices, have had a different experience with the body, which is get deeper into the body. What resonates with you? What is your intuition telling you? What is calling you? What are you ready to let go into the past? It's getting deeper into your body. And so I see yoga teachers, and I see lawyers, and I see women who run girls groups and book clubs. I mean, I just see them doing divine goddess in ways that only they could. And so it's not, even though there's an overlap with motherhood, There's certainly nothing that says that in order to be a divine goddess, you need to be a mother. And we don't see that message coming from the feminine voice in spirituality, because we just see it as embodiment and intuition, and spirituality is just more relational and on the go rather than a checklist. That's more of what we see, and that can be applied in a million different ways.
I love that. And I think it relates to any body, right? So regardless of what body you come in, do you have the capacity for creation? And I think the answer is yes. We all have the capacity for creation, and we all have the capacity for relationship, right? And so just those two things together create a multitude, I think, of opportunities to sit and think how much of this is being motivated by, like you're saying, tasks or production, or I have to make an income, although they can be correlated. I think that there's spiritual practice in ways that I make an income, but there's also productive ways, productivity ways so versus kind of just sitting in creative energy, creating, sitting in flow, sitting in what it is that's coming forth, maybe more organically or intentionally than just the productivity model. Yeah.
Yeah. And that we need both. And this isn't a place where we're just going to shame men and what they do. What we see in stories is something really beautiful, where there's a masculine energy that creates a space of a boundary, of a safety, of a security. And then there's kind of this goddess energy in the middle, whether that's in a relationship or in a community. And the goddess kind of heals herself and heals outside of her. And so the masculine energy that creates that space then is healed by the goddess. And so historically, it's really been this kind of goddess or feminine energy that does the healing and the relationships and that deeper space. But it also needs sometimes that masculine energy to say, like, these are the walls of the house, or these are the walls of the relationship, or these are the boundaries of the community that we're going to protect. And that's a different energy, but a needed one too. And so when we're talking about matriarchy, we're not talking about just keeping men as sex slaves in the basement. We're really talking about how can we value what the masculine energy does and all the amazing things that it can do, either individually, when you're trying to say, this is going to be my business name, I'm going to file this paperwork, I'm going to create this space to do this. So then the feminine energy can fill it with creativity, with intuition, with the things that call you, with the things that make you light up, with the things that make you feel good in your body. And you need both energies individually and in your relationship and in your community. And so there's space for everyone in that kind of flux.
Yeah, for everyone and for every aspect of ourselves, right? Because you said at the beginning, we all have these traits one way or another. Well, I'd like to finish with you have 6 kind of points on how to depatriarchy your spirituality. And if you're okay, because we're kind of at time, another 10 or 15 minutes, because I think this would be a great wrap up. So the first one some of these we'll go through quickly, but some of them I want to pause. But number one, I want to pause. Number one is just giving yourself permission to exist. This really speaks to me. I really love starting with permission. I talk about giving yourself the pep talk, and the first P in PEP is permission. So permission to be, and I think when you really sit and think about that, how many social constructs can we think of that tell us how we should be, how we should exist? Whether it's through gender roles, whether it's through capitalism, whether it's through religious lenses, whether it's family expectations. I mean, think about, I'm sure everybody who's listening can think of at least 5 shoulds that come from different places in your life, right?
And when I talk to clients about spirituality, I hear, and it took me a while to uncouple my shoulds too. So I'm including myself in this, but it comes up a lot with clients where when we're talking about spirituality, we're still in their list of shoulds. This is what it should look like, or parent pressure of what it should look like, or just societal pressure of what it should look like. And so really the first thing is, okay, what if no person, especially a man, if you're a woman, breaking down that dynamic, if you've really internalized that, because as a Mormon woman, you really internalize that the men in my life know better than me, because you have to have really permission for everything from a man. A man stands in between you and God. And so to decouple that, it's really your first time where you're giving yourself permission that there's not going to be a 12 steps to your perfect life that someone else is going to give you. We're just going to have to claim you for a little bit. We're just going to have to listen to you and your resonances and the voices that you resonate with and the things that call you. And we're going to have to start with your own body. We have to start there. And we have to kind of break this idea that some other guru who went to India, who did the drugs, who's done the thing or whatever, is going to have your plan for how spirituality is going to look like in your life. And so that's first, just permission that I have my own spiritual path, even if I don't know what it is yet. I am the author of that, or I'm the discoverer of that. Someone else is not going to give that to me.
Yeah. Which goes along nicely with your number 2 bullet, which is date yourself, which I think is your language for get to know yourself, right? Get to know yourself, which is so interesting. As a sex therapist, oftentimes, especially with low drive and low desire, because a lot of people, especially people who come in with a female experience and a conservative religious experience, so much of their sexuality has been outsourced to male gaze or male desire, not necessarily because they're attached to quote unquote bad males. I mean, there are some people who are coercive or forceful, but there's a lot of partners out there who are like, I just want to be, partnered with you and relational, but we carry these messages that center somebody else instead of ourselves. And so one of the things that we first talk about as sex therapists is there any capacity to touch yourself, whether it's just like massage your hands all the way to masturbation and self-pleasure, and understanding how your body responds versus always being centered on somebody else. Is that kind of what you're meaning by your number 2?
Yeah, it's really, really similar to that. So when I'm especially working with a client who's coming from religion, in the same way that their sexuality was kind of given to them, their spirituality was also given to them. This is what it looks like to be spiritual as a man. This is what your spiritual path looks like for a woman. And until, and then you come away from that, and then you kind of don't know, like, I know it's not this. I know I don't want to, for example, go to the Mormon temple anymore, but I actually don't know what my spirituality is. And in just like massaging your hands and starting that relationship with your body, you start that also with your spirituality. And so we say, okay, let's listen to 50 different voices this year. Just listen to your body. Which one gets you kind of that buzzy, I'm feeling it. Oh, that feels like scripture in my body. I don't know who that's going to be for you, but I've been talking to you for a little bit and I can recommend these 20 people. Listen to them and see what your body says. Or let's try, I'll show them the contemplation tree. Let's try going out with your girlfriends and reading a book, or creativity, or participating in a pride parade and doing some political work. Let's try a bunch of things, see which ones like, ooh, that really filled my cup. And we can discover that, and so it's dating yourself in that similar way that I'm sure you do on the sexuality side. But we also do that on the spiritual side too, especially when we're coming from religion.
I love that. And that goes straight into your number 3 point, which is re-examining your relationship with pleasure and the body. And I think oftentimes pleasure, especially in like Christian philosophies, has been seen as bad. Like I think in Mormonism, we had kind of like a love-hate relationship with pleasure. On the one hand, we're getting the message that we are here to experience joy, and pleasure is, the plan of happiness. But at the same time, we're getting a lot of messages which come from older Christianity, is the sense that, especially pleasure in the body is not to be trusted. You've got the natural man as the enemy to God, right? So the word hedonism, gluttony, so whether it's, food that you taste or touch that you feel, it's like, ooh, that's pleasure is it's a naughty thing.
Yeah. And so what we have to do there, I mean, there's a whole sexual side to that I'll leave to your expertise, but on the spiritual side, what this looks like is if you've had your inner voice quieted since the time you were a child, if you were raised sometimes it's raised with a religion. Maybe you were raised with a narcissistic parent. There are many reasons and ways that we quiet our inner voice and quiet our body and either trust someone else or say like, this is bad, or just say kind of shut up to ourselves. And we just kind of push that down. And so what we have to do is kind of resurrect that moral compass, resurrect that inner voice, because what happens is, just like if a child was tugging on you, saying, mom, 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 if you ignore that child long enough, they're going to go sit in the corner and cry and just like, I'm not being heard, so I'm just going to be quiet in the corner and cry. And there's parts of our psyche that act like that too, that if you've tried to fit into a box, if you've tried to do spirituality a certain way, if you're coming from religion, if you have religious trauma, whatever it is that tried to put you in a box, there's a part of you that you cut off in the process. And we need that part of you, because that's the part of you that is going to help drive the path forward, because we need your resonances. We need to work with your fears. We need to work with your inspirations. We need to work with your dreams of what feel good and the spiritual practices that feel good in your body for you. But we can't even start that process until we reconnect that part of yourself that was lost somewhere along the way, which is common. I mean, it happens in society. It happens when we build an ego and we build a shadow. That's normal, not just for people coming from Mormonism, but everyone. You've had to quiet parts of yourself, and we need those parts of yourself in order to give us direction and wholeness, and really to be able to follow those resonances that give us our own spiritual path.
I love that. So your number 4 step is reconnecting to the feminine, new voices, and the heroine's journey. I think people might be surprised how often, when you really start paying attention, who are the voices that we listen to? Who are the quotes? Who are the famous quotes? Martin Luther King, for example, I love many of his quotes. His quotes are amazing, but where are the Black women? Where are the Black liberation movement, female voice, and we don't get those usually in the history books, or they're not as much part of our social milieu.
Yeah. So for me, what that looked like is really going into philosophy and philosophy of religion, which is, theology and philosophy is almost exclusively men, even today in school, but also historically. The only people who had the privilege to write about these things were privileged men. And so a lot of that had to do with my own wounded feminine, my own kind of mother wounds that hadn't been attended to yet, where the masculine just felt safer. This logical side of my brain felt a lot safer for me. And so really going back and healing the mother wound and going back and adding feminine voices was just so healing for me. And I didn't realize how much I was depending on male voices because it felt safer for all these, complex reasons and my issues with the feminine. And it just really rounded me out when I was able to add those voices that were missing in my 20 years of academic study of these things.
Would it be okay if I put you on the spot? Like, what would you say 2 to 3 books that written by women or women authors or women poets that just really stand out to you?
Yeah, I'll recommend my own, because I'm going to stand up for myself.
That's right.
I'm going to claim my own voice and say that my own book has a whole chapter specific. I actually wrote the whole book and was finished with it before and didn't have this chapter on the feminine. And I actually stopped production and went back and said, I shouldn't publish this book until I write this chapter and add in specifically, we're going to intentionally add female voices, and this is why. And so I actually stopped production of the book to make sure that this chapter was added. So my own, because I'm claiming my own voice. I really liked the quote that just because it's in my head, Wild Mercy from Mirabai Starr, the tender and loving wisdom of female mystics. And the reason I like that one is because there is less writing. It's not one of those things where we have a lot of writing from men and women over time about religion and spirituality, and we've just preferred the male. It's no, we don't have Bibles written by women. We just don't. And so oftentimes the books are going to be more collaboration kind of text where we're pulling in the quotes that we have from women. And so I really like that one because she pulls from poets like Rabia, who's a desert mother kind of voice. And so I also would recommend When God Was a Woman and Who Cooked the Last Supper. I would recommend those ones. Those are a little bit more historical, but it goes back into really talking about what the divine feminine used to be before Old Testament God kind of took over, and those were really empowering, and how we've missed the female voice and the few scripture and the few writings that we do have. So it is a little bit harder. You do have to sometimes do some digging, but I'd recommend my own book and Wild Mercy, When God Was a Woman, and Who Cooked the Last Supper. So those would be four of my favorites.
Awesome. All right, step number 5, and I might combine this one with number 6. Just notice what helps you feel connected. And then step number 6, give permission to call new things spiritual, which is a bit of what we've talked about today. Like what are the rituals? What are the things that we're going to call spiritual? What's spiritual practice going to look like? How are we going to define it?
Mm-hmm. So this is just really short. So for example, today, my church today was having this conversation with you. This is my church. I'm connected to you. We're exploring these words together. We're talking. Sometimes something you say just buzzes in my body and vice versa. It's absolutely church for me. And my husband did one of his kind of outside bike rides, and then he comes home and kind of lays on the grass, and we give him a popsicle and we kind of play outside as he's cooling down. And that was what our church looked like today. And it's because we've done this work and I've said, oh, actually podcasting or girls' lunches or conversation this is my church. This is what helps me feel alive. This is what helps me connect outside of myself. And my husband has his own thing, and then we're able to support each other on a Sunday, and then also starting to add in the kids too, of like, what are you guys, starting to have those conversations of recognizing these feelings, and hopefully over time, as we try different things, nature walks, books, things like that they can find their own spiritual practices as well.
I love that. I think I love this idea of like just asking ourselves, where do we find awe? What turns us on? What lights us up?
Yes.
What rejuvenates? What helps us rest? Those are all, I think, really great questions, questions to ask ourselves. And another thing I really liked about your book is that at the end of, I think, most of the chapters, you have questions like to kind of spur your own spiritual development, your own spiritual ideas. So I always love it when people kind of include something like that. I have 2 comments I want to just briefly go through as far as that we're getting on the podcast. Brandy Reeves says, I remember the exact moment I started deconstructing the patriarchy of my religion. I was in the shower crying for the millionth time about being single and not having an eternal companion. And then it hit me when I left my father's home at 18 to go to college. For the next 30 years, I had lived without a priesthood holder in my home. And again, for those of you who don't come from Mormonism, this is a big thing. We're really encouraged to get married. We're really encouraged to find that person that we're going to spend time in eternity with. So when that doesn't happen, there can be deep pain and wounds that are more than just about being single, that have to do with your role in life. Anyway, she continues by saying, and I had accomplished so many things without the presence of priesthood, and I realized I didn't need it. As I said before, I'm still working on what my special brand of spirituality is, but it sure does not involve patriarchy. And then Marcy Olson says, listening to female voices was huge for me when leaving the church. I also asked the men in my life to consider reading female authors to understand what our experience has been as women, always hearing from the male perspective. And I hope there's lots of, men listening to this, people who identify as male or as a man, and that you would take that as an invitation, right? Like, how many times have we as minorities listened to male voices, listen to white voices, listen to voices where, there's been some deemed success that makes that voice credible, and able voices, so whether you have a disability, whether you're a person of size, whether you're a minority of some sort, let's listen to the other voices that are not as prominent.
And yeah, and also the ones that like the ones who have big accomplishments, like your Leo Tolstoy, we also have to recognize like his success came at the cost of the women around him who were putting him first and themselves last. And he couldn't have maybe been able to write War and Peace if someone wasn't washing his underwear. And so it's recognizing that too, that like the men who are accomplished and have done amazing, truly amazing things, we also have to recognize that they didn't exist in a vacuum either. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Well, I can't thank you enough for your time. And I'm so grateful that you wrote this book. It's just really inspiring, very spiritual for me to sit and read it. It's kind of one of these books. I have it on my Kindle, but I'm going to get it for real because I want to be able to highlight it. It's kind of one of those books, which is how I feel about a lot of my new Bibles. So what are some final thoughts you want to share? Anything maybe I didn't touch on that you were hoping I would?
Oh, I think we did some good work today. I think we did some good work of just this reminder, and you do this so beautifully with the sexuality side. And I just see so many parallels between the process of claiming your own sexual expression and doing that in healthy relationship too. Because if you're just authenticity, then you can be a bulldozer and you can miss a relational piece, which requires some, healthy communication and interaction outside of yourself. And I just see it so perfectly mirroring what I'm doing in spirituality, which is just helping people to uncover their own spiritual resonances, their own spiritual expression, especially for women who are still being kind of given the list of shoulds of what it should look like until they're shut down and they don't think that they're a spiritual person at all. And I'm sure you see that with clients who don't think that they're like, sometimes they may be asexual, but sometimes their sexuality is just shut down because it's a list of shoulds that doesn't resonate with them, right? And so it's uncovering that and doing that internal work, letting that express out into the world, connecting outside of you. It's just very similar to the work that you're doing in sexuality, and we also can do with our spiritual side too.
Yeah.
And they can be both. For some women, I know that their sexual journey is a huge part of their spirituality because it's really part of their body expression. And so I've seen even sexuality be the place where they're doing that work, which is really cool for me to see too. So
yeah, overlap. I was going to see that. I was just going to say that because I think there's a lot of room for you and I to collaborate because I think that spirituality and sexuality have been divorced for way too long, right? Like they're like when you think about spirituality, and I would do a brainstorm of words, what would people say? It's like, oh, religion, church, angels, halos. And when you say sexuality, what words come up? It's like, well, fucking or missionary position, and I'm like, and I have this sticker that I give away or sell at Sunstone. It's called, and it's fucking is spiritual. And I'm like intentionally using provocative language to really say, no, these things, they can be together. They don't know. And even in sex, you don't have to have the holy righteous sex, whoever gets to define what that is, be the only type of sacred, right? Like, so I think that there's a lot of stuff that we could do.
Yes, there's a lot of overlap there. And for some, sexuality is like the driving piece and where they're doing that work. And for some, it's maybe other areas, but it's still this overall concept of discovering yourself and expressing yourself and doing it in healthy ways. So you're not a bulldozer, but you're able to be in relationship with others who are also expressing themselves. And it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing.
I love that. Well, thank you, Brittany, for your time today. It is a beautiful thing. Check out her new book. It's called No Nonsense Spirituality. She also does great work on social media. So make sure you follow her at No Nonsense Spirituality on Instagram in particular. We'll make sure we put all of that in the links and things so people can find it from our spaces. And if you're listening and you enjoy the work that we do here at this podcast, feel free to leave a donation at natashahelfer.com. You can find it, the podcast page on there. And if you have ideas about topics you want us to discuss or have ideas for guests, by all means, message me about that. And thank you for participating. And thank you, Brittany, for your time and for being with us. I wish you nothing but the best on this venture.
Thank you for doing church with me today. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for having me be part of your church. I love it. I love it. You've been part of mine. Take care.
Okay, bye now.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Na tishki say the so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishki shade the so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. In our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishki shade so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.